Imagine standing in the middle of a battlefield, soaked in blood, and then suddenly your own king sells your homeland to the enemy with a mere slip of paper. How could a king, meant to be the protector, become the merchant of his people's fate instead? This is not a fairy tale, not a legend that ends with, "and they lived happily ever after." This is a true story. The story of a king who, whether out of despair, greed, or being too clever for his own people's good, was willing to sign a piece of paper that sold the very land his ancestors once stood upon. Let us step back. The world at that time was in chaos. Small nations became the spoils of great powers. Some were conquered by the sword, some through trade, and others were ensnared by cunning treaties. And it is here that our figure enters. This king was born into nobility, destined for everything: palace, throne, power, and the prayers of his people every morning. But do not imagine him living like a grand monarch in golden robes with gamelan music playing behind him. No. He grew up in a time when his country was cornered, surrounded by the ambitions of foreign powers, and strangled by debts tightening year by year. His political world was like a house with a leaking roof and crumbling walls, yet inside still overflowing with feasts. His nation's economy lay in ruins, its harvest sold cheaply abroad, while the palace craved gold and jewels. The people starved, but the nobles drank wine and banquets. And amid this contradiction, the king grew with two faces, the face of a ruler and the face of a trader, willing to barter anything, even his own land. Historians describe him in many shades. Some say he was sly as a serpent. Others call him nothing more than a puppet of foreign powers. Old records write that he spent hours at negotiation tables, not on battlefields. Ink stained his fingers far more often than blood. And there lies the tragedy. When the enemy came, he did not draw a sword. He drew a pen. But do not rush to judge. Imagine the pressure. On one side, his people crying out under the weight of war. On the other, foreign powers arriving with promises of gold, debts forgiven, or simply a comfortable exile. The question remains, did he sell his country out of greed, or because he truly had no other way? That is the mystery that keeps this story burning even now. A nation, a people, can vanish not through defeat in battle, but through the signature of a king. And the bitterest truth, after all was done, it was the people who bore the suffering, while the king could live peacefully far away from the land he once pawned. This is the opening stage before the great drama erupted. A king, a fragile nation, and a pen more dangerous than any sword. It all began here.
The 18th century, the world was burning with rivalry. Europe was busy fighting over colonies. The British, the French, the Dutch, like merchants at a night market. But what they were trading wasn't ordinary goods, it was entire nations in the East. The place, the New Centara, a land fragrant with nutmeg, cloves, coffee, and pepper. For Europeans, this was the jackpot of the world. But for the people here, this land was more than plantations. It was ancestral heritage, blood and tears in every inch of soil. Amid this storm, local kings were pressed from all sides. One example was the Sultan of Pontianak, Sharif Qasim, who in 1819 signed a political contract with the Dutch. The deal? The Dutch would protect his throne, but in exchange they gained full rights to interfere in the kingdom's affairs. In other words, half of his sovereignty vanished at the stroke of a pen. In Maluku, the story was just as bitter. In 1667, for the Treaty of Bangaya, Sultan Hasanuddin of Makassar was forced to surrender forts, ships, even trade freedoms to the VOC. It was the 17th century, yes, but its impact echoed far beyond, becoming a pattern of betrayal that repeated again and again. Later kings, from Tidore to Ternate, faced the same choice, submit or be destroyed, and more often than not, they chose to submit. Imagine the ordinary people, plowing fields, fishing the seas, only to hear that their land had been sold by their own king, not with swords or cannons, but with ink and signatures. How did it feel? Bitter, sharper than defeat in battle, because this time it was not foreign enemies striking them, it was their own blood. Dutch sources recorded these contracts with pride, neatly archived as if they were mere receipts of trade. But local sources, chronicles, poems, oral traditions, sang with grief. The people felt abandoned, sold cheap for a handful of gold or a glass of sweet wine. This was the true conflict, not just wars against the VOC or colonial forces, but the inner war within a king. On one side, ambition, fear of losing the throne, fear of rebellion, or simply the desire for comfort. On the other, the people, hoping for protection, yet turned into merchandise. And this pattern was not isolated. In Bali, the king of Klungkung once allied with the Dutch to fight his own kin. In Kalimantan, some sultans traded away territory in exchange for annual stipends. Historians note that many of these treaties were signed in secret, in dark rooms, without the people's knowledge. They only realized it when suddenly they were taxed by foreign faces or forced into labor for roads they would never walk. So the conflict was never as simple as kings versus colonials. It was about betrayal that fractured trust, about how a single signature could be deadlier than 1,000 arrows. And the question lingers, did these rulers sell the land to preserve their kingdoms, or only to preserve their bellies and their thrones? History offers only fragments, but for the common people, the result was clear. It was hell. They no longer saw their rulers as protectors, but as merchants who sold away their motherland itself.
That night, the sky was pitch black. The sea wind carried the scent of salt mixed with the stench of blood. In the port of Makassar, Dutch ships lined up like rows of hungry sharks, ready to devour anything that came near. Inside the city, whispers spread among the people. Do we still have a king, or only a puppet on the throne? The king in the palace appeared majestic in his golden robe, but inside his heart was in tatters. Political contracts had been signed, promises had been made, yet with every signature, another chain tightened around their people's necks. And then the anger erupted. In Sulawesi, Bugis warriors who were once loyal turned to rebellion. They stormed Dutch armories under the cover of night. Arrows flew, blades gleamed, and shouts pierced the darkness, mingled with the roar of muskets. In Kalimantan, young men swore an oath in secret, better to die on our own soil than live as slaves to the invader. They lit torches, stormed trading posts, and set VOC flags aflame. Fire licked the sky, illuminating faces marked by both rage and fear. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the king busied himself with Dutch envoys. He chose to close his ears to the cries of his people, blind to the flames rising outside. His hands trembled, not from the sword, but from the weight of a dilemma. Should he cling to the colonizer for the sake of his throne, or stand with his people at the risk of losing everything? And here the tragedy reached its peak. The Dutch, cunning as ever, exploited the king's hesitation. They deployed combined forces, Dutch soldiers side by side with local troops still loyal to the king. The cruel irony, our own people turned against our own. Battles broke out in markets, in fields, in harbors. Blood mixed with mud. The cries of children merged with the screams of war. Some charged forward with sharpened bamboo spears. Others fell beneath lead bullets. And amidst the chaos, the king remained on his throne.
He shut his eyes, yet heard everything. Screams, prayers, curses. His heart shattered, but his lips stayed sealed. The contract he had signed had become a whip, lashing his people with every stroke. The climax of this conflict was not just in swords and muskets, but in the war within. The people fought with blood and life, while their king battled the crushing weight of guilt. When the sun rose the next morning, smoke still darkened the sky. The people had lost their land, their kin, but the deepest wound of all was this: they had lost their faith in their king. That was the true climax, not only the piercing of steel, but betrayal sharper than any blade.
After the blood had been spilled, after the screams had faded into whispers, a secret rose to the surface. The people thought their king had sold the kingdom out of fear, but the truth was darker still. Old records suggest the king was not merely pressured by Dutch cannons and muskets, he was crushed by debt. Yes, debts inherited from rulers before him. The spice trade, once believed to bring fortune, had in fact enriched the colonizers far more. The trade contracts were crafted like mousetraps. Once you entered, there was no way out. And even more shocking, whispers claimed that some of the local nobles themselves had signed those contracts. It wasn't just the king. They received tributes, gifts of gold, even promises of power. In other words, the king was not alone. There was an entire circle of elites selling out their people's future. The people who once cursed a single man suddenly realized the betrayal ran deep. The king was merely the face, but shadows moved behind him. Imagine the pain. You fight with all your life, believing the enemy stands across the battlefield, only to find the enemy living inside your own house. On the other hand, some historians dared to argue perhaps the king chose this path because he knew his people could never win against Dutch firepower. Better to surrender piece by piece than to see everyone slaughtered at once, they said. A bitter logic, perhaps sensible on paper, yet it burned like poison in the hearts of the people. So who was right and who was wrong? Was the king truly a traitor, or merely a pawn in a much larger game, caught in the whirlpool of colonialism and betrayed by his own circle of elites? That is why this story is never simple. A king who sold his country was not only about treachery, it was also about a rotten system, the traps of history, and impossible choices between two evils.
History is cruel. Sometimes it writes heroes in golden ink, but marks traitors with stains of black that never fade. The story of a king who sold his own country is proof that a man can fall, not only because of enemies outside, but because of the weakness within. Power can blind, wealth can make one forget, and sometimes fear can be deadlier than any sword. But let's be honest. If we had lived in that era, under the shadow of Dutch cannons, among starving people, with debts tightening around our necks, would we have been braver? Or would we too have signed that bitter agreement? That is why this story never truly ends. It is not just history, it is a mirror that forces us to ask, if I were that king, would I fight until my people were gone, or surrender for a sliver of survival, even if branded a traitor forever? History closed this chapter with bitterness, but also with a warning. A country can be sold with a signature, but the price of betrayal will be paid for centuries, by the blood of the people and by the memory of the nation. And as one old record once wrote about the land that was sold, better to die with honor in your own land than to live in comfort beneath another's flag.